All right. So, nod for the gate, Dad.
If you don't want to ride, don't nod for the gate.
That might be a good
my
way
philosophy of life.
That might be a good way to open up these things.
Yeah. Life's a rodeo. If you don't want to ride, don't nod for the gate.
Well, we've nodded for the gate, and we would like to welcome you to our first episode of Coffee with Cowboys. And I thought that it would be fun to get to know you a little bit, Dad. I'm Amy Betcher. This is my dad, Dale Thompson. And we'll just jump in. So here we go. So where were you born and raised, Dad?
I was born and raised in Whitewood, Saskatchewan, a little prairie town. Grew up, my dad worked for a Hereford ranch, and I grew up living there, feeding cattle with a team and sleigh and hauling all our wood and water and hay and everything, pretty much everything we did, especially in the winter, was with horses, often even going to town. That was my start in life. As far back as I can possibly remember, I ever wanted to be was a cowboy. I never wanted to be anything else. I haven't always been a cowboy, but that was my heartthrob.
Huh. So for some people who have grown up in this generation or growing up a little more urban, I think like when people think of the country, they think of cowboy, but that wasn't necessarily the case for you. You grew up on a ranch, but people who farmed then weren't necessarily cowboys.
No, there's a difference. I've written a poem about that. I won't do it today, but between cowboys and farmers, and I've got nothing against farmers. My dad was a farmer, and a very good one, and I'm extremely hard worker. He's a good hand, and I learned an awful lot about horses and that. Cowboys figure the world looks best framed in the ears of a horse, and I like driving teams. I grew up driving teams, and I love doing anything with horses, but I always figured the view looked best over the ears, although it looks pretty good between a team of good horses squatting down to a load too.
So there's a difference, because your dad was actually a really good cattle man.
He was a good stockman, very good horseman, one of the best I've been around. Probably the best teamster I've ever been around. He could take spoiled, balky horses, and he'd have them pulling for him in no time. They'd work well for him. He respected horses, but he demanded respect, and he was never mean, but there wasn't any compromise in him. And horses respected him. They worked well for him.
Huh. Okay, so then, but as far as you can remember, you wanted to cowboy. Was there someone that you thought made a pretty cool cowboy figure?
I wrote a poem about him too. Old Dave Wilson is a very good friend of my dad's, and he came into Canada with one of the last herds over the Montana-Alberta border. He's the only real cowboy I ever knew. He could braid rawhide, he could rope like you wouldn't believe, he could break horses. He was another extremely good horseman. He was a real cowboy. I even tried to walk the way Dave Wilson walked.
How old were you when you knew Dave Wilson?
I do a jackrabbit. He traveled a perch and stud back then. People were still breeding draft and draft cross horses to work the land. My dad was still farming with horses when I was born, but I wasn't very old, and he got a tractor in the 50s. But Dave Wilson traveled this perch and stud, and he brought that stud to my dad's place, and I just watched in amazement how he could move around horses he'd never seen or whatever. He could read them. He knew what to do. That stud was extremely well trained.
That's pretty cool.
Yeah.
Was there a moment when you really felt like a cowboy?
Well, there was one. I did write a poem about that. I was I was 13 years old. By the time I was 12 or 13, we'd gone from putting up loose hay with the hay sweeps, and which was good. We swung into square bales, and at first they baled them on the ground, and later we baled them on the wagons and made stacks out in the field, and we'd haul them in with a team and sleigh later in the winter. But we were haying, and it was probably about August, and they raised papered Herefords that they sold, a lot of Hereford bulls. They even sold some overseas. So they were really expensive, fancy bulls. And 5 yearlings had got out and headed north along Scissors Creek towards the Capel Valley. And if they got down on the Indian Reserve along there, they would be extremely hard to find. They could be in 1,000 draws, and chokecherry choke draws, and pincherry and willows, and hawthorn was the worst to ride in. So they hired me at 25 cents a day to find these bulls. I was 13 years old, and Harold Davis said, when you find them, you'll never get them in by yourself. Just find them and come back, and we'll stop haying, and I'll get on a horse, and we'll go get them. And they were like 5 miles, 6 miles out of their place when I found them along the top of a creek. Well, they were down in a creek, and I dug them out of there on my horse, and I got them home by myself. And then I rode out to the hayfield and told them, and they were pretty impressed, especially when I told them where I found them. And that was the day I knew I was a cowboy. So
Okay.
I wrote this. I just entitled this "The Hand." It was my first paid riding job, finding 5 young wayward bulls, all papered yearling heifers, and not one of them a cull. I was 13 years old and 5'1" on a horse of 16 hands, but I was drawing 25 cents a day doing the job of a man. It was my first real pay riding job, though my tack was old and worn, a worn-out saddle and homemade bridle and a hand-braided rope tied to the horn. It was late on the 3rd morning when I finally found their tracks, and after fishing them from the hawthorn and oak, I got them headed back. Late afternoon, with their tongues all out, my horse all soaked with sweat, I pushed them through the last wire gate. Was I a hand? You bet.
Nice. So you were 13 when that happened. And how old are you now?
Well, multiple times of that, but I'm 71 years old. I'll be 72 this year.
Are you sure?
Yep, I'm sure. Born in 1945, before the war was over.
I thought you were 76. Why do I
I
think?
might have to change that out. Maybe I am. Yeah, I'm 77 this year. You're right.
I
am.
think you're 77, Dad.
You got to blurp that all out of there. Well, I never was good at math.
Okay, so you're 76.
Yes.
And you grew up in Whitewood, Saskatchewan.
Yep.
And I know that it's a twisty, windy road to how you got to Two Hills, but we can cover that later. But what brought you to Two Hills, Alberta, Canada?
Well, probably talking to one of the biggest attractions. I had a daughter and her husband, and well, when we came here, they only had 2 little gaffers. So it got us closer to them, brought us closer to my daughter and her husband and 3 boys in Calgary, and later on a daughter and her husband moved to Fort McMurray, so it put us just about central. But I'd had a pasture where I managed and rode up along the Smoky, between the Smoky and the Peshawska rivers up north. And there's a friend of mine, Pat Roach, managed the pasture down here, Rannick pasture, and he was always kind of after me to come ride for him. So it was a combination. I came down to ride for him, and it was good because I'd spend the summers down here with Amy, and Terry rode with me quite a bit and see some of my grandkids and get paid to do what I love to do.
Nice. So how big is Rannick?
Rannick's a little more than a township in size.
Wow.
Runs along the south side of the North Saskatchewan River and back in.
Quite a lot of bush.
A lot of bush. Too much bush.
Yeah.
More bush than I like to ride in, but it's a nice pasture. It's a good pasture. I rode with good guys on there, that's for sure. I've enjoyed it.
So if anyone is watching who's a little more urban and they're wondering what a community pasture or a grazing lease, a community grazing lease is, my husband describes it as summer camp for cows, pretty much. Yeah, it's extra grazing for farmers and ranchers. They can send, I don't even know, what's the average size of a herd that one patron can
around
send?
30 pairs and a bull.
30 pairs, so 30 moms,
some
30
of them it
babies.
varies. If they've been there long enough, they kind of earn the right to run more cows, and eventually they can run, I think 60. I think it's 60 pair. Don't quote me on that. 60 pair and 2 bulls. What it is it helps the farmer out because he doesn't have to buy, own, or rent land to graze on. It's got some real advantages. They bring them in the spring, usually late May, and drop them off at the corrals. We count them in, and then they don't have to worry about salt, water, doctoring them, nothing. Protecting them from wolves or bears, that's all our job. And they can just go back and farm until end of October, and then you come and get them. So most of them that run them there really think it's a really good system, and it is. If it's managed well, it is a good system.
All right, well, would you happen to have that poem on Dave Wilson handy?
Well, it isn't called Dave Wilson, but and his son Shag was an awesome horse trainer too, but I just tried to copy him. Everything he did seemed to work for him. So I wrote a poem called Hang and Rattle. He rode a form-fitter saddle with a 30-foot king tied hard and fast, wore bat wings and open crown and custom-made spurs built to last. His raw-boned, hammerhead gruella looked like he could maybe rank. With his big Roman nose and little pig eye, there wasn't much question he could turn the crank. But there was a look in the old-timer's eye telling me he'd never bail, no matter when the bronc broke in two and really swallowed his tail. With his custom-made boots and the coffins to the heels and his buckshank tucked into his belt, with a deep seat and a faraway look, he'd play any hand he was dealt. He was all cowboy, from the frog to his ears. I'm not meaning to prattle, but one look at him sure had me convinced he knew how to hang and rattle. I painted you a picture of my hero as a kid. I could probably never saddle his quietest horse, but I tried to copy all that he did.
Aw, that's pretty sweet, Dad. Kind of paints a picture of you, helps me understand where you got your style from a little bit with your open crown and your bat wing chaps. Although now you use shotguns usually. But
Yeah, I've switched to shotguns since I got wussy.
I don't think so. Okay, what's another one you got?
Well, I got another one to do with riding. It's called Riding Lessons. Maybe we can wind up with this. Because my dad was a good horseman, and he taught me some things about riding, but most of it I learned watching Dave Wilson or listening to him. Who taught you how to ride? Whose clinic did you take? Did you take any riding lessons, or just learn from your mistakes? When I was 5, I started riding. I'd crawl off the fence onto a horse. I'd just sit there and hold on tight, and he would pick the course. Not a saddle or a bridle, just a halter or a twine. I could barely see over old Mac's ears, but we got along just fine. By the time that I'd turned 12, I'd crawl on anything with hair. That's when I got my first saddle, and I'd ride in whether foul or fair. I rode a variety of horses, and from whom I learned a lot. I learned some things about dismounting, and sometimes the horses picked the spot. Sometimes I'd weather a storm, and my chest would kind of puff. The next bronc that I'd step on was willing to call my bluff. It matters not to the horse how good you've rode before. You prove all over to the one you're on just how high you would score. So my riding lessons were expensive, especially the ones that cost me pride. Others were slightly cheaper, they just cost me hide. So I made myself a saying that for me was kind of fitting. Don't tell folks how good you ride, say it by where you're sitting.
I'll choose that. It's hard to brag about how great you are when you're sitting on the ground. That's for sure.
And nothing can humble you like a horse.
Nope. Well, thanks for joining us for our first episode of Coffee with Cowboys, and we hope to see you again.
Hang and rattle.